You're listening to Aphrodite, My Love, a novel by Quint F. Kamba. Forward. Love, how merciless you are, to ignite my heart, only to cast me into darkness. Like a fruit forgotten on the vine, I am left to decay, my spirit yearning for what was never mine. With these haunting words, the author Quint F. Kamba invites you into a world of unbridled passion, poignant longing, and the timeless pursuit of love. Settle in, my love, and let the journey begin.
Letter 1, back to the bush. Aphrodite Kasim. My love, it's been over 4 decades since the last time I saw you. I remember it clearly, like it was yesterday. You must have been 16 or 17 and I had just turned 18 a few weeks earlier. For decades I've wondered what it would be like if we met again. Would you stop and talk to me? Would you say how has life treated you, Nkosi? I hope that life has been good to you, Aphrodite. I hope that you found someone that loves you and worships you as much as I did. My love for you is as deep today as it was all those decades ago when we first met. That's why I'm writing to you today. It is a mystery to me how it is possible that I should be able to maintain such feelings for you for this long. I am afraid that I shall carry the pain in my heart to my grave. If only I could see your face, hear your voice, see your smile, one more time, one last time. If you could even acknowledge my existence, even for the briefest of moments of time, I would truly die a happy man. Since we never really talked, never got to know each other, and you may only remember me as that boy from Chaplin High School who pestered you endlessly, I will share with you who or what that crazy boy was. Please, Aphrodite, have mercy on that boy, whatever you might like to think of him. He held profound admiration and boundless love for you. Brace yourself, Aphrodite, because what I'm about to say might just rattle your world, even squeeze out a tear or two. And don't be surprised if a grin sneaks in, but fair warning, I won't sugarcoat the ugly bits. Life's a twisted maze, Aphrodite, and I'm laying it all out, no glossing over the gritty details. Oh, and hold on to your seat because there's a surprise waiting at the end of this roller coaster. I promise you won't be let down, my love. It's a wild ride from start to finish, and you're in for a journey that'll leave you breathless. Just in case you're interested, you can go right back to the beginning and read Two River Farm and the Cry of the Jackal, about the boy who dared the sun. He flew too close and was scorched. But who has time to read that much these days? So I will give you a brief summary here, my love, my dazzling son. Don't worry, I will get back to us in due course and then tell you the rest. Just in case you're curious, I'll affectionately address you as darling quite often, hoping you won't grow tired of it. So here we go. My name is Nkosayatun Gondoma. I was born in the bush on a remote farm in Rockford in place called Selukwe, now called Shirugwe, way back when Zimbabwe was called Rhodesia. I shall use the old names to mark the period before independence of Zimbabwe, and the new names to mark the period after. It will probably get confusing even for me, but let's just give it a go. I had a sister, but we were both abandoned by my parents when I was 3 and she was 5. My parents went their separate ways into the big old wide world and were virtually lost to us. We were raised by my grandmother and uncles and aunties and lived on the farm until I was 10 years old. One night in my 4th year at my primary school called Rockford Primary School, my entire family, headed by an uncle called Uncle Bill, one of my many uncles, had to abandon our farm as a battle of the Zimbabwe Liberation War was raging close to our farm. Kalashnikovs were rattling loudly and bullets were crashing into trees on our land. We left that night with just the shirts on our backs and our lives. After a couple of weeks languishing at a bleak old reserve, we were rescued by my other uncle, called Uncle Ben, and we ended up staying with him at his house in the township called Nkoba, in Gwelo, now called Gweru, of course. So you see, Aphrodite, even way back then, our worlds were already slowly converging. We were in the same town. Although not quite yet, we still have a considerable journey ahead before we meet. My sister and I ended up staying with my uncle and his family at his home in Nkoba for about 3 or 4 months. We lived about 10 of us in a 6-roomed house in an area of Nkoba called the Sixes. I can tell you, Aphrodite, that those 3 or 4 months were the happiest of my life up until the day I first met you. Then, no sooner than I had begun to settle down with my newfound family and was embracing being a city boy, rather than a remote bush farm boy, then one night the floor was taken from beneath my feet. Uncle Ben loaded my sister and I in the back of the van of yet another uncle, called Uncle Eric. We found ourselves heading back to the bush, this time to an area called Lower Gwelo, located west of Gwelo town. Sitting in the back of the van that night with my sister and a bunch of strangers that my uncle was giving a lift to was one of the saddest days of my life. I felt like a tiny insignificant bug ready to be squashed by a giant boot. We were traveling at night, and in the darkness of the back of the van, I cried myself to sleep. We arrived at Uncle Eric's farm in Lower Gwelo in the middle of the night. As I opened my eyes, I found a girl peering into the back of the van, calling out mine and my sister's names. Nkosi no Sifo, wake up, she called indebly. I looked around the back of the van, and where every bit of empty space on the van floor had sat a person, everyone had left except for my sister and I. I knew that Uncle had dropped them off, one by one, at or very close to their homes on the way to his farm. I was glad at some point during the journey I had closed my eyes and fallen asleep. The thought of being extricated from the city to go back to living in the bush had upset me deeply, especially as it had been so sudden and without any prior warning. One minute I was living it up in Nkoba Township, in a nice big clean house where I could watch television every night. The next we were in the back of an old yellow van full of Mbebeli people heading back to the bush. I hated the idea of going back to the bush with every fiber of my tiny body. I was going back to herding cattle and sheep, drinking foul water full of flies and cockroaches. I was going back to sitting in a kitchen whose walls were covered in flies. I was going back to a place where I had to battle with flies over my plate of sadza and cabbage. God forbid on the rare occasion we had meat, the flies literally swarmed the plate, and it was even harder to enjoy the meal then. I raised my head and looked at the face of the woman who was shaking my shoulder and calling my name. She had a soft, friendly voice. I couldn't see her face clearly in the dark, but I figured with a voice like that she had to be pretty. From her voice I thought she had to be much older than I was, maybe 16 or 17. I had only just turned 11 back in September, and it was only around the end of October or beginning of November. The Ndebli girl helped my sister get off the back of the van whilst I climbed out and jumped down from the last step of the van. The ground was the same dusty white sand that was in the yard on our farm in Selukwe. I guess this is it, I thought to myself. My new home. My heart sank as I picked up my old brown suitcase with my old blanket and 1 or 2 items of clothing. I had never felt so lonely, dejected and lost as I did getting off that old yellow van. I didn't know any of the adults from this side of my very large extended family very well, and was terrified of adults. I would happily go into a cage with a lion than face an adult African man or woman. I had never stayed with Uncle Eric or his wife Auntie Ida, so I had no idea whether they would hate me, beat me, like Uncle Bill had done at the old farm back east in Selukwe. For no apparent reason, I started crying, tears streamed profusely down my face. My sister was sobbing too, so I figured she was feeling the same way. We had just been cast away with people we hardly knew in the middle of nowhere, in a part of the country we had never been before. Hey Nkosi Ungakali Uklalani Konthi. Don't cry Nkosi. Why are you crying Yulambailna? Are you hungry? Oh Bialapa booty hoza. Kume my boy, kume. Come, my aunt cooed and mused me, taking the suitcase off me and handing it to one of the girls whom I assumed was a maid. Then she picked me up and held me close to her chest. Many years later I found out this was called a hug. It was very nice and had the effect of calming me down immediately. My sobbing subsided. She walked towards a bright light coming from a doorway. I was studying her face closely, for any sign of treachery, cruelty, and adult deviancy, but I only found warmth and kindness in her eyes and I started feeling much better. She carried me through the doorway into a room which turned out to be a kitchen, and sat me on a bench with a large wooden table in front of it. The girl that had woken us up from the van sat no sifo next to me on the bench. There was another girl in the kitchen that was already busy with pots and pans. She was already dishing up sadza and amasi. Much to my surprise, they only spoke in Ndebele, so they didn't call sadza sadza, they called it istwala and amasi, sour milk. I had never heard so much Ndebele spoken in one place continuously like that before. It was fascinating. I completely understood the language without being able to speak it very well. I much preferred speaking Shona, which I grew up speaking in Selukwi. I figured the only reason I understood Ndebele was because my mother, who was Ndebele, must have spoken to me in Ndebele before she abandoned my sister and I to my grandmother when I was only 3 and my sister was 5. It was fascinating hearing these women speaking my language continuously, and I loved it. It was like music to my ears. I wonder, Aphrodite, if my brain was tuning into some babyhood memories, long forgotten, but still able to trigger something deep in the cerebral cortex. There was so much sadza and amasi my sister and I ate our fill. The irony wasn't lost to me that I was Ndebele, who couldn't speak Ndebele. When my stomach was full and the young girl kept saying eat in Ndebele, I said Nguda, Shona, for I'm full. The girls looked at each other and repeated Nguda, bemused, and one asked the other what that meant. It means he's full, Uncle Eric said, walking into the kitchen, immediately setting me on edge. The girls laughed. Kanti Wainam Kosi, Owukalumius Ndebele, Lono Sifo Shurt Kosi, you don't speak Ndebele, and you two know Sifo really? Aunt Ida asked with a hint of disapproval in her voice. I shook my head, as I was too embarrassed by the whole situation. Come, I will show you where you'll sleep, Uncle Eric said, standing in the doorway of the kitchen. Like the kitchen back on our old farm in Selukwi, it was a separate standalone room from the main building that housed the bedrooms. However, that was where the similarities ended. This kitchen wasn't a round thatched hovel, where every square inch of the surface was covered with flies. No, this was a square room with a hard cement floor, nicely painted white walls, and I saw no more than a couple of flies at the most. Yeah, I had a thing about flies, Aphrodite, I hated them. The kitchen floor of the old farm in Selukwi was cleaned by smearing cow dung all over it. This was meant to seal the floor and prevent buildup of dust, but I think instead it caused flies to swarm into the kitchen. I never understood why, with so many roots and berries in the bush that could be crushed to make some sort of floor seal, some crazy person thought it was a good idea to use cow dung instead. Another nice thing was that the fire was not built under a metal grate in the middle of the kitchen floor like we had at the old farm. There, the fire was contained in a great big black iron stove with a chimney that carried the smoke outside. There was something so decidedly clean and efficient about that whole setting, I started feeling quite comfortable. I stood up and followed Uncle Eric out of the kitchen, thanking my auntie and the 2 girls for the delicious meal as I left.
Letter to the bush. Much to my very pleasant surprise the next morning, I was woken up by my cousin Fanuel. Fanuel was the 3rd born of Uncle Eric and Aunt Ida, their eldest. His brother was called Pierce and a sister called Zinel. They also had a little brother called Guy, who was later followed by another boy called Dingani. Fanu had a hard time waking me up, because my sister and I had arrived late the previous night and I had slept in. In fact, when I did finally open my eyes, I thought it was the middle of the day, judging by how bright the day appeared outside. We'd better go and find everyone cozy. It's quite late, Fanu said, standing beside the single bed where I had slept the previous night. I looked around instinctively, taking in my new surroundings to get my bearings. The room was long and quite narrow with a single chest of drawers and 3 beds. It was quite untidy, but the walls were nicely plastered and painted a creamy off-white color. It had a single window that looked out straight into what appeared to me like a thick jungle, right up against the house, except for a very small patch of perfectly green grass between the window and the edge of the forest. I jumped out of bed, still in my everyday clothes, which were really like a second skin to me, as I permanently lived in them. One of my cousins used to find it quite amusing how I would take a bath and then put on the same dirty clothes I had been wearing for weeks on end. I had recently acquired a new garment to my set of clothes called a mini brief, of which I was extremely fond of. The mini brief had been heading for the bin in Koba when someone had the brilliant foresight to ask if it would fit me, as it was too small for my cousin Mandla. I had tried it on and it fitted so snugly I was immediately enamored with it. I also owned a pair of cream-colored trousers and a blue checkered shirt which I only wore on Saturdays to church. Even though I had had those for a good few years, they still looked as good as new. My cousin Daniel from Selukwi had also given me an old pair of black shoes, which I needed in town because of the hard and rough surfaces like tarmac and gravel in the city. But back in the bush, I had no real use for shoes. Barefoot was just fine. I followed Fanu outside, walking across a large sitting room and out of the back door which we'd used the previous night. I was amazed by the scene that greeted me outside. The farmhouse was nestled bang in the middle of a jungle. There were lush msasa and mopani trees right round a very tiny yard, so that some of the tree branches hung over the roof of the house. The house was nothing like the farmhouses at the old farm in Selukwi. No. This was a really big, nice, modern-looking house with a zinc roof, big windows and glass doors. I had never seen anything like it up close. Even more to my surprise, the exterior of the house was plastered to a smooth finish and painted white. I couldn't help comparing it with the houses at the old farm. That house made them look like shacks. It looked more like a white man's house in the city than an African man's house. So I started wondering what in the world a house like that was doing out in the middle of nowhere. The idea terrified me, so I asked my cousin Fanu if a white man lived there. But he assured me that it was his farm and they lived there. I thought Uncle Eric must have been very rich indeed, although I didn't understand why he drove an old yellow van instead of a Peugeot 404 like Uncle Ben. This was not the end of the surprises. The kitchen where we had dinner the previous night was a big square building with a zinc roof and a small chimney sticking out of the corner of the roof. It had a cement floor, unlike the round hut with a thatched roof and mud floor that was cleaned by smearing cow dung all over it of the kitchen at the farm in Selukwi. Things were beginning to look really weird to me. This was not the bush I had expected to go back to. I had expected to go back to the bleak poverty of our farm in Selukwi, not this rich oasis. It didn't feel real, it didn't feel right. Fanuel decided everyone had gone to the fields and we should go and find them. I asked him how far the fields were and he said, not far. A short distance across the valley and we're there. I followed Fanuel down a narrow winding path through a thicket so deep you could not see across the farm at all. If I stretched arms out, I could touch trees on either side of the path. The path descended straight down so that at some point you could see the top of trees and bushes spread out across the valley and rise again so you could not see anything beyond the ridge of trees. To my left as we headed northwest towards the fields the valley continued and I could see familiar tall trees like msasa, mopanis and acacias. The farm was ragged and breathtakingly beautiful. We descended to the bottom of the valley and walked up the other side of the hill. At the top of the hill the tree line abruptly gave way, revealing the vastest field my eyes had ever seen. The field was only a couple of football fields wide, but stretched a mile east and seemed to extend indefinitely to the west. It was guarded at the tree line by a barbed wire fence of the same type we had at the old farm in Selukwi. Hello, old friend, I whispered to the fence as I crawled between the barbed wire lines, careful not to get any part of the body or clothes caught in the barbs of the barbed wires of the fence. I hadn't noticed Fanu go through a circular contraption which functioned as a gate. He stood in front of me laughing and pointed at it, saying, there's a gate, stupid. We both laughed. Fanuel and I had been good friends. In the past his family would come and spend the school holidays at our farm in Selukwi, and all the boys would go out to herd the cattle together every day. On the side of the field a tall rock face stood like a giant wall almost blotting out the sky to the north of the field. We were now on the field walking west towards a group of people in the distance. As soon as I saw them I started feeling very uncomfortable again. I was terrified of adults. They needed no reason to beat small kids like us and we were constantly on guard to not do anything that might provoke them in any way, even a simple thing such as getting up late and turning up for work late. When we got to the group of people I noticed there were 3 or 4 young men that I didn't recognize at all. there was my Aunt Ida and the 2 girls from the previous night. Uncle Eric was not there, and as I had not seen the yellow van in the yard, I figured he must have traveled somewhere. Bantuan. Good morning, my children, cried Aunt Ida, hugging us both, one in each arm and bending down to our heights. Remembering her warmth the previous night, I smiled and shyly replied, Ekosini, in Bebeli. Aunt Ida introduced me to the boys and the 2 girls, but I wasn't really paying any attention, because there was something wrong with the picture. Something was missing. It wasn't until she said, Nosifo went back to Guelo this morning with your uncle. She's going to stay with your uncle in Bulawayo, so she can go to hospital there. Nosifo had a bad heart, which meant that she couldn't do anything too physically demanding, like running or working in the fields. She was also the quietest person I had ever known, barely speaking more than a few words a day. She mostly communicated by action and inaction. I never saw her smile even once when we were little. I'm sure she had been irretrievably damaged by losing both parents at the age of 5, that she almost became a mute. I don't know if I thought that back when we were children. I'm sure I did, because I was sad for her. I was sad for me. But it made me so sad to see my sister so unhappy all the time. I was happy to hear that they were finally going to try and fix her heart. Aunt Ida then studied the 2 of us for a few seconds and asked what we were doing there. Not wanting to look ungrateful for her kindness to me the previous night, I volunteered and enthusiastic. We've come to help in the fields, in perfect and doubly impressing both her and myself. The girls laughed and the guys smiled and shook their heads as if in disbelief. Aunt Ida lowered her voice and addressing me directly and in as gentle a voice as she could master, she said, You're just a child. We don't expect you to work in the field here. I winced as if I had punched on the nose. She bent down to my height and put her hand on my shoulder and said, But I tell you what, if you really want to help, why don't Cici Sibanjal take you home and make you both some breakfast? Then you can go and see if the cattle are grazing okay in the paddock. That cheered me up a great deal. Something to do, work, the thing I had been conditioned to do from the moment I could walk. After a hearty breakfast, Fanuel led the way to the paddock. We headed south following what looked like a dirt road that gradually turned west along the farm fence to the left. About 100 yards down the path, there was a line of trees that formed the bank of a long pool of water which turned out to be the start of a river. The pool was full of perfect, clear water, and I could hear a gentle trickle of running water. Since it was not raining and the pool just emerged from nowhere, I figured there must have been some sort of spring there. I had seen this crazy phenomenon at our neighbor's farm, north of us at the old farm. They were the ones with the mulberry trees I loved so much, and were actually relatives of my family as they were my cousin Daniel's grandparents. Quite close to their yard was a spring with sweet, refreshing, cold water permanently trickling out of the ground, even on the hottest of days. It had created a tiny pool and a tiny stream. It was mind-boggling. We had just walked past the pool when I suddenly felt the hairs on the back of my head stand on end. This was a bush boy's way of telling that there was danger nearby and to stop. Tease a natural instinct, a sixth sense that enabled our ancestors to survive since the beginning of time and is still in human beings who live close to nature. I immediately stopped and scanned the ground and saw to my right, a couple of arms' length, a long, thick snake, slowly slither past us, heading towards the water. This was the most, dare I say it, amazing snake I had ever seen. It was yellow with purple, red, black, and God knows what other color stripes. It almost looked like a toy or a slithering rainbow. I was sure it was deadly, and if it had passed any closer I would probably have been bitten and dead in a few minutes. I cried out, Snake! Fanuel, who was already several steps ahead, turned round and looked at the snake which by now had made a splash in the water and was swimming gently across the surface to the other side of the pool. Oh, that's Jezebel, she's harmless, Fanuel said casually as if he might be describing some old grandmother. What? I screamed. You have a great big dangerous snake so close to the house. What if it comes to the house whilst you're sleeping? We should kill it. No, she won't, he said. You should leave God's creatures alone and they won't bother you, he added. I thought hard about it for a minute as I caught up with him and we carried on walking along the dirt road. Fanuel was younger than me by about a year or 2. But he was big-boned and already stood a couple of inches taller than I was. I didn't argue with him because at the old farm at Rockford in Selukwe we had 2 snakes like that. One we'd also named weirdly enough, Jezebel, and the other with named Mbuyan Hima, Grandma Black. They were both huge black snakes whose habits we had become quite familiar with. One of the snakes lived by the kraal and enclosure for cows. The other lived by the well almost a mile away from the kraal. In the evening around about the same time you would come across the snakes heading out to hunt for the night, so we always knew to be very careful in those areas around those times. To the right of us rose thick forest of trees and to the left, there was a single line of trees almost evenly spaced out along which was a barbed wire fence and beyond it was a road that I was sure was the road we'd come down the previous night. We carried on walking for a while, until we came up to a great expanse of savanna grass and I could see in the distance a herd of cattle calmly grazing the semi-dry luscious grass. It was a very serene scene and I immediately felt as if I was back at the old farm in Selukwe. Just like the old farm and almost in the same direction southeast, there was a bunch of big boulders that emerged from the ground in the middle of nowhere. They were huge granite rocks with wide flat or rounded tops stacked randomly on top of each other. They were always fun places to play, and we headed straight for them. As we got close to the rocks, we were confronted with the most amazing scene. The rocks were populated by dozens and dozens of these beautiful lizards of different sizes. The lizards had the most amazing colors of blues, reds, and yellows. We clambered up to the top of the highest rock and sat down watching and talking about the lizards. The lizards had scattered when we started climbing the rocks, but after a short while of sitting at the topmost rock, they started coming out and carried on doing whatever they were doing. We'd interrupted them. They chased each other, pushed each other, jumped up to catch flyers with their tongues. It was the most mesmerizing free show I had ever seen. I explained to Fanuel that we didn't have such lizards back on at the old farm and that I really liked his farm. We had great fun watching the lizards. Every so often it would get quite scary when a lizard was emerging from a crack or between the boulders. Before you could see its legs it looked just like a snake and I was even more terrified of snakes than I was of adults. A bite from one was certain death. I had never heard of an adult killing a child, but a child from my old school in Rockford had been killed by a black mamba. After a while I told Fanu that I wanted to see the river. He had replied, oh, it's just down there. I will take you there. First let me go back to the house to use the toilet and I'll be back. Can't you just go behind the bush? I asked. But he gave me such a look of consternation I quickly changed the subject and said I would keep an eye on the cattle. Already heading back, he shouted, you don't need to worry about them. They won't go anywhere. I checked the space behind me on the rock for bugs like scorpions and centipedes and seeing none, I lay on my back with my hands clasped behind my head. I looked at the deep blue cloudless sky. It looked like it was past noon. Even though it was October or November, it wasn't baking hot as it would have been at that time at the old farm. There, the temperature was like a nice, comfortable, warm blanket. The place was bathed by a gentle, clear sunshine without the piercing heat of back east. I was finding the whole experience really surreal. I looked at the vast blue sky above. How deep was it? How far was the edge of the universe? Where did the stars go during the day? I closed my eyes and random pictures suddenly started flashing past my eyes. Flash. And I was a little boy no more than 4 lying in bed fighting for my life back at the old farm. I heard someone outside saying, I don't think he's gonna make it. His fever is not coming down. We've done everything we could. I was delirious, falling down an endless abyss located behind the dam on our farm. Later that night I had woken my grandmother up, thinking I had wet myself. But she'd said you didn't, but all your clothes are wet from sweating. I had burned what I'm sure was malaria off with a high fever and survived. By the next day I was playing hop skip and jump outside with the other children. Later I went looking for the abyss behind the dam wall I had seen in my delirious state. It didn't exist, my mind had made it all up. Flash. And Uncle Bill was beating the crap out of me for no particular reason. I pushed that thought away so fast it didn't even bring a tear to my eye. Flash. And I was sitting in Mrs. Kamedz's class in my 3rd year of primary school at primary, in the afternoon, just the 2 of us. Me pretending to be reading whilst she did the marking so I could just look at her beautiful face. She was my first love at 9 years old. These were some of the happiest moments in my life. Crazy, right? Aphrodite, flash, and we're running from the farm while a battle blazed behind us. I pushed that image down so fast and so hard it must have squirmed as it disappeared from my thoughts. Flash, and I was in Koba Township in Guelo. Oh blissful Koba, that heavenly place with its green parks and rows of pretty houses. Oh Anna, I'll never see you again, I cried out in despair. I brought both hands to my face to cover my eyes from the glare of the sun. Anna was my newfound love in Koba. She lived across the road from our house. The thing is, she actually liked me as well. Just the previous day had let me wear her watch. She had held my hand and put the watch on for me. Our heads had been so close they literally bumped and we laughed. I tell you Aphrodite, that was one of the happiest moments in my life. Even better than watching television for the first time, which had been pretty awesome. Hey Kosi, what are you doing? Who the hell is Anna? My cousin Fanu said, jumping up onto the rocks, making his way to our perch. Nobody, I replied dismissively, trying to hide my sense of excitement. Well, you want to go and see the river then? Fanuel suggested. The river was a few hundred yards in a northerly direction from our rock perch. We descended down the riverbank beside a huge round boulder that overhung the edge of the riverbank. The river was dry except for the middle bit where water cascaded down a very shallow sloping rock ledge. The water was crystal clear and smelled sweet. It was hard not to dip my hand in it, scoop some up and drink. We knew that even though the water looked clean, it was still full of germs that could make you really ill. I stood there watching the water run down the rock ledge, speeding up as it went round a bend. I was astonished. The water was flowing the wrong way. At the old farm the rivers flowed east, but at this farm in Lower Guelo the river was flowing west. I thought it was pure magic and wondered if the sun also went the wrong way. I was going to find out at sunset. I bent down and splashed water all over my face, closing my eyes just before the water hit my face. The water was icy cold. I felt amazing. It was deep cleansing, right to the soul. Suddenly, I heard loud war cries, hundreds of feet splashing in the water. When I opened my eyes I saw a Zulu warrior running towards me, his assegai raised ready to strike, black and white shield hiding his torso, so that only his head donned with a cowhide and ostrich feathers showed. The whites of his eyes were red with fury and the black of his eyes were as cold as steel. I fell forwards into the water. All around, the semi-naked barefoot Zulu soldiers were jumping in the water, with great splashes and crossing the river in great big leaps and bounds like wild kudu escaping from a predator. Fanuel laughed until tears streamed from his eyes. The icy water shocked my senses back into me. A vision, I thought to myself. I had had many visions like that in the past and I wasn't frightened by them. I had spent 3.5 years in the bush at the old farm herding cattle and sheep before starting primary school at nearly the age of 8, and had experienced things no child of that age should ever experience. In the bush you didn't survive only by watching where you put your next step. Danger could come from anywhere. Under your feet, behind you and around the corner. In front of you and from the trees above you. In the wild your whole body is antenna keeping you safe. You never feel more alive than in a dangerous forest, except of course when you're in love. I'll come to love later, we're still too young to know what love is yet. Aphrodite. The deep spirituality of that place had spurred a vision in my mind. After rolling around in the water until our bodies were frozen cold and teeth were chattering, bodies shivering with cold, we sat on the smooth warm boulders that formed part of the riverbank. This place was truly magical. It took me back to a similar spot near Rockford, my old primary school back east. That place had also given me visions, the first time I had been there, but not of soldiers, but of young African maidens, naked from the waist up, crouched on their heels on the sandy riverbed, scooping water from spot wells dug in the sand into colorful clay pots. It was a scene of my ancestors and I had felt like they were reaching out to me from the distant past. It felt good because it made me feel less alone, and it assured me that everything was going to turn out okay in the end.
Free the boys. So Aphrodite, how am I doing so far? I hope I'm not boring you to death. I must say though, I've really enjoyed talking to you these past few days. Takes me right back to the time when I first met you and I used to talk to you all the time. In my head of course. Sometimes, when out on my own, I would even speak to you right out loud. Course you'd answer. We'd have a full-on conversation you and I. You see, darling Aphrodite, when I first met you, I captured you in my mind, locked you in my heart, and over the years you became part of my very being. There was no me without you. This of course, was not your fault. This was all my doing. I had no idea I was unleashing a chain of events that would lead to tragedy. I tell you what though, my love. If you had loved me back, our love story would have made Romeo and Juliet sound like a bad Bohemian Rhapsody parody. I would have loved you to the ends of the earth, right to edge of the universe. There's nothing I wouldn't have been able to do for you. My love for you was endless. It could have filled all the oceans and seas of the earth and spilled over to the rest of the universe. My eyes are welling up right now, Aphrodite. Because I loved you so much and all that meant nothing to you. Zero. Nothing. Had I possessed the prescience to fathom the depths of love's agony, I would have willingly stepped into a cage teeming with ravenous lions, inviting their fangs to rend my flesh asunder. The searing pain of their every bite would have been a balm compared to the torment of living bereft of you, the one I hold most dear. They would recount the tale. Behold, a noble soul who surrendered to the voracious maw of lions, not in vain sacrifice, but in fervent homage to love's supremacy. For in this mortal existence, no endeavor stands loftier than that which is fueled by love's unwavering fire. Sorry about that digression, let's get back to the story. My stay at Uncle Eric's farm turned out to be one of the happiest and enjoyable period in my childhood. Aunt Ida was the most loving and kindest woman I had ever come across. She ran her household with such love and warmth time stopped mattering to me. The kids were not expected to get up first thing in the morning to go and work in the fields or herd cattle and sheep or anything like that. We could get up any time of the day we wanted, eat whatever we wanted any time of the day. Life was so good. We had amasi, thick delicious sour milk, and sadza every lunch. For dinner we had meat and vegetables with sadza or rice. The girls, Sibangile and Cindy under Auntie's supervision sometimes made homemade butter. I remember offering to help and putting in some elbow grease, winding some contraption that churned the fresh milk to make butter. Round and round I turned it until my arm hurt. It was great fun. They would add some salt to the butter, mix it all in, spread a little bit of butter on a piece of bread, taste and repeat until the butter tasted just right, all the while listening to music and dancing when a good song came on. Both girls were very pretty. Sibangile was tall, dark and slim with large happy and friendly eyes. When she smiled she lit up the kitchen like a bright star. We called them Cece, which means big sister in Debly. So Sibangile was Cece Sibangile and Cindy was Cece Cindy. Cece Cindy was the opposite. She was very light in complexion with beautiful flawless light brown skin. She was slightly shorter and rounder than Cece Sibangile, but just as pretty. They reminded me of Cece Joy and Cece Betty from the old farm back in Rockford. The two girls had suddenly vanished from our lives when I was 5 or 6 years old. I know what you're thinking. I fell in love with Sibangile or Cindy. No, I love them. I love being with them and watching them dance, but I didn't fall in love with either of them. I already had Anna in Guelo for that. I didn't think about Anna all the time like I did with you. I just felt very happy every time an image of her flashed in my mind. This was by far the happiest household I had ever lived at. You would not be wrong to say, it ran entirely on the fuel of love. Time flew so fast that I barely noticed it going by and soon it was Christmas. I had always loved Christmas even back at the old farm. There would be a big meal of rice and chicken in the afternoon, and sometimes we would get presents, like a balloon each or a Pascal sweet. It was amazing. Once I even got a small translucent yellow water gun. It literally had been the happiest Christmas of my life. In Lower Guello at Uncle Eric's farm, preparations for Christmas Day took on epic proportions. I had never seen anything like it before. The farm boys cut down a small fir tree and mounted it in the sitting room of the big house. The sitting room was a huge room which stretched the entire width of the house. It was very well lit, because it had so many windows that were so large I was sure they started from the ground and ran all the way to the bottom of the roof. Once the Christmas tree was mounted, Sibangile, Cindy and my little cousin Zinel hung balloons, cards and feathers, streamers and all sorts of colorful paraphernalia on the tree until the tree looked magical. It was a truly magnificent sight. That's when I heard in whispers and hushed tones that the boys were coming on Christmas Day. It was then that I remembered that we were still in the middle of the Zimbabwean Liberation War. In the blissful comfort of Uncle Eric's farm, I had forgotten all about the war, and our lucky escape from it at the old farm in Selukwe. How at the old farm for nearly a year, we had gone to sleep to the sound of bazooka shells exploding and the rapid rat-a-tat-tat of Kalashnikovs firing throughout the night from dusk till dawn. At Uncle Eric's farm, all was quiet. We went to sleep to the simple sounds of nature, frogs croaking, the occasional sound of an owl, hooting, and distant sounds of monkeys arguing in the middle of the night. There were no guns firing or thunderous rumble of bazooka, mortar shells, exploding like a terrible thunder. So, when the girls started whispering about the boys, I was both excited and terrified at the same time. It could only mean one thing, that war was coming to the farm in Lower Guello as well. Soon we would have to run again. Where would go this time? Who were the boys? The boys, Aphrodite, were the African freedom fighters, the guerrillas fighting against Ian Smith's Rhodesian soldiers. They were split into two forces, the Zanla group which operated back east in Mashonaland and the Zipper forces that operated in Matabeleland, I guess mainly in the west part of the country that was then called Rhodesia. In the whole year of the battles that raged every night back east at Rockford, I had never seen a single guerrilla. They moved and fought in the night, and by day they melted into the surrounding bush like ghosts. You could step right over one in broad daylight, and never know he was there. If you saw them in the day, you'd not live to tell the tale. I was so jealous of the boys in my class back at Rockford in the 4th year of primary school who had seen the guerrillas. They would come to class every morning, regaling their stories of how the previous night they had spent the whole night singing battle songs with the guerrillas in what they called pungwis, how they had acted as mujibas, lookouts, for enemy soldiers and reported any sign of activity from the enemy to the guerrillas. So when I heard that the Zipper fighters would be coming to the farm on Christmas Day, I could hardly contain my excitement. Finally, I would get to meet the brave warriors of the liberation movement. Christmas Day duly arrived. I remember it well. The year was 1977. We got up early that day, unable to contain our excitement, not just for the food but for the events that were going to unfold that day. From the moment I got up, it felt like a Saturday church day when everyone got up, washed and put on their best clothes to go to church. We were Seventh-day Adventists, you see, so unlike most people who go to church on Sundays, we went to change on Saturday. We even had a name for the day, Sabata. The atmosphere was crackling with excitement that day. Everyone was so happy. For breakfast, there was more bread, butter and jam than you could eat. By mid-morning, the girls had already laid a table so long it went halfway the length of the sitting room. They loaded it up with a sumptuous buffet. There was chicken, steak, roasted maize, boiled maize, rice, potatoes, sadza. You name it, it was all there. But that was not all. There were crates and crates of bottles of Coca-Cola, Fanta and my favorite, Spa Letter. We were allowed to drink as much as we wanted. By Christmas, my cousin Pierce, Fanuel's older brother, had come home from school in Bulawayo, and in the morning had been tasked with hooking up the record player and speakers in the sitting room. They had placed it on a small table, and beside it was a box full of records. The girls played songs by Molathini, like Lokoikyud, The Wake Up Call, Amaswazi Embolo, like Tholilail, Shut Up and Listen My Friend, Stymila, The Train, by Huma Sekala and many others. We ate, we sung and danced all morning. I had never experienced such unbridled joy, such freedom and such happiness in my entire life. That was not the only reason for my joy. As a Christmas gift, I had been given a brand new polo shirt with white shoestrings and holes on the button strip. I loved that shirt so much and I looked so handsome in it. I thought if Anna could see me that day, she would want to marry me. Laughable, right? Yeah, but I was no ordinary 10-year-old. Had seen stuff, had done stuff. Just before noon, whilst dancing to Huma Sekila, I caught a shadowy figure by the corner of my eye and turned round to face the window. There was a young tall man with sunglasses standing outside the window, peering purposely inside the room as if looking for someone. In the yard stood two other men facing the forest and standing with their feet apart as if they were at attention guarding an invisible master. 3 or 4 men ran past the 2 men at a pace you could only describe as fleeting, as if floating through the air like a water buck jumping across a river. When things happen so fast you can't be sure they really happened, your mind goes into overdrive. In the front of the house, I saw one man leap across the window heading towards the side of the house. All the men carried guns. They were surrounding us and there was nowhere for us to run to. I was frozen on the spot, terrified. So this is what it feels like to die, I thought to myself. Death appears suddenly and without warning. At least I was quite old. I had made it to 10. Imagine if I had died at 7 or 8 like that boy at Rockford School, who was killed by a black mamba. My mind was racing. Everything was still and quiet. If the music was still playing, I didn't hear it. I could only see the scene playing out in front of me and hear the voice in my own herd. Time stood still until there was a loud scream of pure unadulterated joy from Aunt Ida. They are here, they're here, she screamed, pointing at the man at the window. The boys are here. She got up and ran to the door, followed closely behind by Sibangile and Cindy and everyone else. It took me a minute to realize what was going on until Aunt Ida was hugging the man who had been standing at the window. They were all hugging and laughing, ululating, screaming with sheer joy. Then the penny dropped. These were the boys we had been waiting for all morning and anticipating for days before Christmas. I had not expected such a dramatic entrance. I don't know what I had expected actually. Maybe for them to turn up in a white Peugeot or some type of car as people normally did when traveling any long distance, but certainly not to appear like ghosts out of the blue from nowhere. After a few minutes, the 3 men entered the sitting room behind Aunt Ida, who was talking excitedly non-stop. One of the men marched straight past me without saying a word and headed straight for our bedroom, whilst the other disappeared down the corridor. They both returned shortly and saluted the tall, light-skinned man who was talking to Aunt Ida, and ending each sentence with Mamamdala, which actually just means auntie. Coast is clear, Commander, they both announced, saluting him. He was much younger than he had appeared to me when I first saw him standing by the window outside. He was very light in complexion and had a short beard and mustache. He had straight nose and bright brown eyes that belied superior power and intelligence. I liked him instantly and I wanted to grow up to be just like him. He gestured with his hand slowly and said, Mamamdala, let me speak to the boys for a second. Then turning to Pierce, Fanuel and I and all the other boys who were there for Christmas. Boys, I'm Commander Ngwenya and this is Comrade Gebamabunu. He said, pointing at a younger dark-skinned skinny man of about 18 or 20 standing next to him. I want you to listen very carefully. I want 2 of you to go back onto the road and find our tracks and sweep them off. Break some branches off a tree. Sweep the tracks and hide the broken branches afterwards. Be very careful, listen out for trucks and look out for soldiers. Can you do that? The commander spoke with a great booming masculine voice that reverberated in my chest. The commander wore a pair of dark jeans and a black polo shirt under a green safari jacket with many pockets. Around his neck he had a copper bullet with a leather strap through it. He looked so powerful. We all put our hands up. How about you two little ones? The soldiers won't suspect the small ones, he said, pointing at Fanuel and I with a long skinny finger. Well, Aphie, can I call you that, Aphrodite? I would be lying if I didn't tell you that. That was the proudest moment in my life. To be selected by guerrilla commander to clear his tracks so the Rhodesian soldiers would not be able to track them to the farmhouse was awesome. I can find your tracks. I'm used to tracking sheep all the time. I volunteered the information without being asked to. My heart was already bursting out of my chest with pride. We practically ran outside, but the commander firmly told us to walk and not run. Remember, you don't want to raise any suspicion. We walked out of the gate and looked up and down the road and listened for army trucks as the commander had instructed. Up the road heading north, the dirt road stretched straight up as far as the eye could see, but down the road it bent towards the right following the perimeter of Uncle Eric's farm. The area was so wooded with thick bushes and tall trees. The road was like a tunnel through a forest. We listened out for army trucks briefly and hearing nothing we started searching for the boot tracks left by the guerrillas. First we searched south down the road and then north up the road. The tracks were not hard to find. I had been a cattle herder and shepherd since the age of 4 and was used to tracking the sheep whenever I lost them, which was a lot. So finding large boot tracks was like a walk in the park. Once I pointed out the boot tracks to Fanuel, we broke some branches off some bushes and used them to sweep out the boot tracks off the sandy surface of the dirt road. Fanuel tried to match the steps to his. He literally had to jump from one boot print to the next to match the giant steps taken by the mighty gorillas. After sweeping the boot tracks away, I ran up and down the road again just to be sure we had done a good job. Finding no other tracks, we crossed over the opposite side of the road, took our branches through the thick line of trees alongside the road and crossed over the barbed wire fence of the farm opposite Uncle's farm and dumped the branches there. I took one look at the lie of the land, scanning the horizon for any signs of soldiers, but there were none. I was surprised that on the side of the road was practically barren of trees and the grass had been grazed to the roots. You could see for miles round, in the blue hazy sunshine of that day. Even my old farm at Rockford had more grass and trees than that. We crossed back to our side of the fence and headed back to the farmhouse. I can tell you, Aphrodite, this was the proudest day of my life bar none. Those boys from my class at Rockford School could go eat their hearts out. I too had met the guerrillas and even helped them. I too had contributed to the war effort. I was so proud. Of course I could have done more, but I was only 10 right. When we got back to the house and reported back to Commander Ngwenya that we had found the tracks and erased them, and that there were no army tracks nearby, we had even checked the coast on the other farm and it was clear. The commander saluted us and said, "Well done, my little freedom fighters." Well, you can only imagine what a comment like that does to a little boy's ego. It's a wonder my heart didn't just burst right there and then with enormous pride. He then tasked us to go and check the coast every half hour whilst 3 or 4 comrades sat down and devoured great huge plates of meat, rice, potatoes, vegetables and maize. There was never more than a few comrades in the sitting room and they kept rotating so new ones came in, ate and left except for Commander Ngwenya and Comrade Gibamaboon. At around midday Commander Ngwenya ordered 2 of the comrades to lay out some of their weapons on the floor so he could show them to the boys and girls. The comrades laid out so many different types of guns, magazines, cartridges and even bullets. They placed a row of different size bullets on the table, but Commander started with the guns. He explained that the big gun at the edge was the famous bazooka that fired explosives that went off with a bang like thunder. Then he explained that the gun on a tripod is the sniper rifle called a G-something that could hit a man from a mile away. Then there were the Kalashnikovs, also known as KK or submachine gun or just sub. That was the favorite of all comrades. I myself carry one, he said, lifting the gun hanging from a gun strap on his shoulder and holding in front for us to see. I noticed it had a metal but which he folded and unfolded for us, demonstrating its versatility. He said that the KK was so simple to use and you didn't even have to aim it. You could just point and spray the bullets. It can fire 600 rounds a minute. He added as if any of us would understand what that meant. Then he came to the pistols on the table and finally to the magazines and bullets. He picked up the largest of the bullets, which was the length of Parker fountain pen and almost twice as thick. This, he explained, looking round at everyone, is a sniper rifle bullet, that one there, he said, pointing at the gun on the floor with a tripod. This bullet can kill an elephant and if it hits a man's head the head will explode like a big pumpkin.
Letter 4. A voyage into new beginnings. The next day when I woke up it was sometime in March or April 1978, and I was back at Uncle Ben's house in Koba in Gwelo. What? Of course that doesn't make any sense, Aphrodite. How could one day I'm hundreds of miles away in Lower Gwelo on Christmas 1977 and the next day it's some day in March 1978? The next day should be at least Boxing Day, right? 77, right? So, what I actually mean is that the next real and solid memory I have of that time was around March the following year in 1978. I've searched my memory to the ends of the world and for some reason, the last thing I remember about that Christmas day in 1977 was Commander Ngwenya holding a long bullet and saying it could kill an elephant and if it hit a man's head, his head would explode like a pumpkin. After that, I remember nothing. I don't remember what time we went to bed that day, nor what time all the comrades left. I remember nothing. Zilch. I don't even remember how, when and by what mode of transport I got back in Koba. It doesn't bother me too much though, because I have a similar experience of absolute memory loss. It happened after Uncle Bill beat the living daylights out of me once. I completely lost my memory of a period of about 6 months. And even decades later I'm unable to retrieve that memory. So I explain it as some sort of post-traumatic response which shut down a part of my brain to protect itself from imploding. I told you that my parents abandoned my sister and I when I was 3 years old, right? And for some reason I could never think about my mother. It's like every time I tried to remember her, my brain just turned to fog and I couldn't see her face at all. It's like the brain was saying, there are too many skeletons and dragons down there. Don't go there or you will be eaten alive. Maybe one day I'll ask Fanuel or Pierce if they remember what happened. But it seems to me that even extreme cases of happiness also cause my brain to shut down completely, because I don't remember being anything but very happy at Uncle Eric's farm. What do you remember of your childhood, Aphrodite? Was it as beautiful as you? I can't imagine anything but. I know it's taking a while for us to meet, Aphrodite. It's still a few years away and there's so much still to come before we do. It's driving me insane, because all I want to do is talk about you. I feel so happy and alive when I'm thinking about you. All the pain and worries of the world just melt away. It's like you're right here with me. Of course this has its downsides, because you're not here and as much as I want to hold you close and run my fingers through your hair I can't. Hold on a second. I'm getting ahead of myself again. Because you didn't even want me back then, so the thought of me running my fingers through your hair might make you vomit. That's another thing right there. My brain just won't accept that you hated me. Can't even imagine someone as beautiful as you being capable of hating anyone. Even Aphrodite. When it comes to you, my love, I'm as crazy now as I was back then. If I had won your love, and you had asked me to steal the Empire State Building, I would have stolen it for you without a second thought. It would be standing tall in the middle of Gweru High Street right now. Anyway, as I was saying, I found myself back in Koba at Uncle Ben's house one evening. All my cousins were there and we were gathered around Mamandala and Uncle Ben who were poring over a magazine full of pictures of houses. Every so often someone would cry, "Oh, I love that one. Oh, that one is so nice. Beautiful. Hey Madota. That one looks like a church. We could live and pray in it at the same time." Laughter all round. The houses in the pictures were out of this world, Aphrodite. So big and so beautiful. Some of them had swimming pools with clean blue water. Others had tennis courts and some even had both a tennis court and a swimming pool. I had only ever seen houses like that from the bus or car on the way into Gwelo from Selukwe. They were all amazing. But why on this particular night had they chosen to look at pictures of pretty houses? I had no idea. I must have fallen back into city life with ease. Koba was a lovely township. We lived in an area called Masakisi, the Sixes, because the houses were 6-roomed. They were actually 8 rooms if you counted the bathroom and toilet. Every morning after breakfast, 2 slices of bread and jam and butter. I and a new boy who had moved next door went out to explore the township. The boy was about my age and we had the first same name. We had pretty much become friends immediately since we had so much in common. He too was an escapee from the war in the remote bush villages and farms and like me had not been to school in months. We had both become quite feral. I had not been to school since June or July of the previous year. I loved school, but I didn't actually miss it back then. I was enjoying exploring Koba every day, and besides I had never been to school in a city. So I really was a bit uncomfortable about going to school in town. We explored the new part of Koba over the road south of Uncle Ben's house. These houses weren't there the last time I had been in Koba and they were shiny new. In fact, further down they were still building new houses. These new houses were long and pretty with large windows that had diamond-shaped burglar bars. The walls were of exposed reddish-brown bricks. The gardens had small, pretty perfectly green lawns with sprinklers running every day. One morning we found ourselves having tea and biscuits with a South African lady who lived in the new house across from our house. She told us her name was Mrs. Jamalo and she had moved from South Africa with her husband and 2 kids. I think she was actually nursing one right at the time if my memory serves me right. She spoke Xhosa so fast I almost had trouble understanding what she was saying. But I think being new to Rhodesia she was a bit lonely, and talking to 2 kids with Zulu names must have helped her feel less homesick. We weren't the best Xhosa or Zulu speakers in the world, although we understood them very well, because both languages are very similar to Ndebele. Our endless explorations sometimes took us across the lovely green park in Koba past the jail up towards Machipasai stores. There we would ogle the cream cakes and hope that one day we would be able to afford the 10 cents it cost for a small slice. We discovered that if we hung around the shops long enough, sometimes some older boy would let us play slug, table football. We would sometimes sit in the park and watch gliders rise up into the air and circle about in the blue sky like giant eagles. One day we decided to try to find the place where gliders were taking off from. We were intrigued by the circular thing that always fell back to the ground when the gliders took off and wanted to find out what it was exactly. We wound up walking for miles and miles and finding a place called the Dodo Bins, a refuse dump near the Bata Shoe Company. We saw people rummaging around the rubbish with sticks, so we decided to join them. But soon we're running from there when Kosi found a small hand sticking out of the rubbish. We didn't really stop to be sure if it was real or just a doll's hand, but we never went back there again. Our lack of purpose in life got us into all sorts of mischiefs. Once we offered to go door to door at different houses selling doormats for my grandmother in exchange for some pennies so we could buy the slice of cake or play slug. We were doing really well going house to house and even managed to sell a couple of mats before we got to this particular house. This lady invited us in, then she wanted us to come to her bedroom, and when we did she decided she was getting too hot and started disrobing. We were out of that house and out of the gate running down the road so fast you couldn't have caught us with an automobile. Naturally grandma didn't allow us to go round people's houses ever again. So our only hope for earning some money to buy the slice of cake was dashed before it even got off the ground. In the late afternoons we waited for the school kids to get back from school, as we had done the previous year when we had first arrived in Gwelo. This time though none of the kids seemed that interested in seeing us. Not even Anna, the love of my life then. She had decidedly turned cool since the last time we had been together before suddenly disappearing to Lower Gwelo. I didn't know if my leaving without saying goodbye had annoyed her. I kept trying to find her on her own so we could talk and I would tell her that I really liked her and I was sorry I had left like that. That I had no choice in the matter, but she was never alone and she disappeared inside her house and never came out. I don't know how many times I walked up and down her street to see if she would come out and we could talk. But alas, she never did. For some reason in all that time I never thought about my time in Lower Gwelo where I had been so happy. I guess when you're a kid you're a stupid, egotistical, self-centered, narcissistic nincompoop. Life settled to a gentle rhythm of getting up late in the morning, breakfast, exploration, wait and see if I could see Anna on her way back from school. Dinner, watch and smoke on TV, prayer time and the news. Prayer time and news time was big at the house in Koba. Prayer time consisted of singing a hymn from the hymn book in Ndebele. My little cousin, although she was like 8 or 9, already led the singing and knew most of the songs by heart. That really was impressive because there was no way you would catch me singing in front of anyone let alone adults. The hymn was followed by a Bible reading from Uncle Ben. Then he selected someone to say a prayer. This was then followed by a final hymn. The whole thing would take about 20 minutes to half an hour. It was fun at first, but I really hated it when it fell at the same time as Doctor Who was starting. Sometimes we'd miss the whole of Doctor Who, only catching that whirlpool and the credits at the end of the episode. It was exasperating. The news though we never missed came on at 8 p.m. The white lady would start jabbering about something or other and finally get to the interesting bit. The war. They would show helicopters swooping down on what they call terrorists, then list the body count and show images of dead terrorists as they call. One night they showed a picture of a boy not much older than I, 11 or 12 at the most, and said this terrorist was shot and killed in a recent operation. The boy, who was very beautiful, looked like he was sleeping in an old rye field except for the gaping wound in his stomach, guts hanging out and flies and maggots all over him. It was terribly inhuman. Aphrodite. Mamamdala stood up crying. What terrorist? It's just a boy. It's just a kid, she cried. She left the sitting room and went back to her sewing machine in the dining room. I had never seen a grown man cry, but from the side of my eye I caught Uncle Ben, taking his glasses off and wiping a tear from his eye. After that, there wasn't a single dry eye in the house. This one image brought the war back home to me. I cried myself to sleep that night. That could have been me in that rye field. I still wasn't sure if I was going to be sent back to the old farm. I was sure this time I would not survive the war. The nightmares started almost immediately after that news round, and I think I stopped being a child on that very night. I swore to myself as soon as I was old enough and big enough I was going to Zambia to join Commander Ngwenya and Comrade Geba Mabunu and seek vengeance for that boy. That night the first nightmare started. I was back at the old farm in Rockford. I was being chased by a male lion. The only thing that stopped it from catching me was a river between the cattle kraal and our homestead. Couldn't cross over to me because the river was flooded and I couldn't cross to run home because it would have caught and devoured me, so I kept running west. Suddenly I ran straight into an ambush of Rhodesian soldiers. One stood up, shouted, "Terrorist!" Took aim with his rifle and shot at me. The bullet hit me in the stomach. It was hot and the wound bled profusely. I woke up clutching my stomach where the bullet had entered. I felt around the wound, but was very pleased to find out that there was no wetness on my stomach and I wasn't bleeding. My stomach hurt like mad though, so I got up to go to the bathroom, put the light on and peed. The pee was very painful and at the end gushes of blood came out. The bilharzia that I had been nursing for months since the last days of Rockford had gotten much worse. I was in agony and had a terrible fever. My morning life was not much fun for me. I was really ill. It didn't take much Mamamdala to figure out what the problem was. By mid-morning the next day Uncle Ben had taken me in the car to some fancy clinic past the fairgrounds in Gwelo on the west side of the city. A lovely pretty nurse took my temperature and gave me an injection in my bottom. It hurt like hell, but I really liked it. I knew this meant I was going to get better. Uncle Ben said if I had left it any longer I might have become sterile, never be able to have children. Imagine that, Aphrodite, we'd never have been able to have children. I would never have been able to have children. Children with you, Aphrodite. Imagine that. Here I go again. Damn Kosi. She never loved you. Can't you get it through that thick skull? The nurse gave me some pills to take once a day with food and told Uncle I should come back for more injections once a week for however long. My older cousin used to take me by bus to the main bus terminal in Gwelo and from there we would cross town due east, past the fairgrounds, hang a right and down there somewhere was the clinic where I got my bilharzia injections. After the first injection I was okay. For the subsequent ones, about half an hour or so after I would feel so ill, the smell of food cooking made my stomach lurch with such pain and discomfort. I didn't know what to do with myself except sit in the sun and wait for the pain to recede, which it did sooner or later. I don't know what days we traveled to the clinic, but as I wasn't going to school, time didn't matter much. Every day was the same as every other day except for Saturdays. Saturdays were truly divine days. Aphrodite. Everyone would get up early in the morning, get washed and change into their best clothes, pile up into the Peugeot and drive to church. Most of the time, though, there were too many people in the house to fit in the one car, so the rest of us would walk. I much preferred to walk than sit in the boot of the Peugeot because walking through the park to church was like walking through the gardens of heaven itself. When the pastor started preaching and talking about going to heaven, I really wondered why bother with heaven. Nkoba was just as beautiful as heaven to me. We had everything anyone could ever dream of down there. Nice houses, great park, good food, electricity, tower lights. Men in uniform on 3-wheel bicycles with a cool box in the back, selling cheese, freezits and ice creams. Everything was there. So why go to heaven and leave all that behind? It was during one of these sermons that I noticed her. A pretty girl of my age or maybe slightly older. I soon found out that her name was Portia, just like the Porsche at Rockford. By now Aphrodite, you can guess what she looked like, right? Light brown skin, big brown eyes, face like an angel, yada yada yada. I'm trying to point out if you notice a pattern here. This boy Nkosi is a serial lover boy. He has a definite type. He cannot resist a nice light brown skin pretty girl. He is attracted to them like a moth to a flame. One day he is going to get burned. Find this boy and get him off the streets before he falls in love again. He's a danger not to the public, but to himself alone. Jokes aside, Aphrodite, Portia was really pretty and soon she became my only reason for going to church. Don't get me wrong, I believed in God and all that. But I liked Nkoba so much I thought it was as good as heaven, so what was the point of praying and going to church really? Saturdays were also special because those were the days that Memdala donned her apron and cooked the Saturday gourmet meals that were always followed up with the most delicious puddings of all sorts, like jelly and custard, puree pawpaw and mashed avocado. All my favorites. Life Aphrodite was perfect. I was literally walking with the angels in heaven every day of my life, and things just kept getting better. The boy who had been a cattle herder, shepherd, all-round general farm dog's body since he could walk was finally ditching the farm life and becoming a full-on city boy. The heavy curtain of country bumpkin was finally being lifted from my milieu. Shortly after church and lunch one Saturday afternoon, Uncle Ben announced a surprise to the whole family. We were to get in the cars. Yes. By then we had 2 cars, a Datsun 10 for Uncle Ben and the old Peugeot 404 for Memdala. We were to drive to a new house he had found at a place called The Plots. He wanted us to see it and tell him if we liked it. We were bundled into 2 cars and were driven across town until I had no clue which direction we were going, north, south, east or west. We ended up at a house way out of town in the middle of absolutely nowhere. When we finally got to the destination, the car drove through a gate with the obligatory sign that said, "Beware of the dog." I smiled gleefully remembering the Bisopo Loinja sign with the head of a dog biting a leg of an African man I had seen in Selukwi and had made us out of the cars and stretched our legs. All my cousins and aunties and grandma were there. Looking around, I couldn't believe what was in front of us. The biggest house I had ever seen. Walls painted a beautiful lime green and a red roof of corrugated iron. But that's not what impressed me the most. It was the long driveway to the house. Nearly 100 yards of road tiled with pink, green, orange and yellow tiles which went round a circular rockery shrouded in all kinds of different flowers, the middle of which was a tall palm tree. The back opened up to a wide yard with soft golden sand behind which was a smaller house with a flat roof that we later found out was called a boy's kaya, boy's house, more commonly known as servants' quarters. Behind the house to the east was a line of tall fir trees that ran straight down 500 yards south to the corner of a fence. To the west, nearly 200 yards, stood a perfectly straight line of about a dozen trees, evenly spaced out. The trees were so tall they seemed to touch the blue sky. Someone asked what kind of trees they were and Uncle said that they were mulberry trees. I kid you not, Aphrodite, when I tell you that I jumped for joy. Did it mean that if he bought the house we would have our own mulberries that we could gorge ourselves on all summer, all day long? I had always wanted a mulberry tree because I loved the fruit, particularly how they colored the hands and the tongue purple. Our own mulberries, that was like finding a bag of gold in the street. We were still standing around admiring the surroundings when a shiny new Mercedes pulled up behind the Peugeot and out came the tallest white man I had ever seen. He was wearing dark sunglasses. I instinctively hid behind one of my aunties, poking my head out to watch what he was going to do next. He didn't have a gun, so that was a good start. To my great surprise, Uncle Ben literally jumped forward laughing joyously and say Mr. Laban and extending his hand to shake the white man's hand. I nearly shouted stop. I love my uncle so much I didn't want him to die, but everything happened so fast. Uncle Ben clasped the white man's hand and shook it vigorously. It was only then I realized the white man was not there to harm us, and breathed a sigh of relief. Uncle Ben turned round and introduced us with a wave of his hand covering the entire group. Mr. Laban barely glanced in our direction, but said the house was open and we were free to go inside and look around and to take as much time as we liked. The interior of the house was not that impressive, to be honest. It had the same number of rooms as a house in Koba. The only difference was that the rooms were 2 or 3 times larger. And oh, it had light switches on the side of the walls instead of string hanging down from the ceiling. I rather liked the string more as it was more fun to play with. The real magic of the place was outside. The size of the land, the grand orchard, the huge garden, the lawn on the front garden, the fact that you could not see another house in any direction you looked. It was just like back at the farm in Selukwi. I was already sold just on the mulberry trees and the house was just the icing on the cake. When we got out, I happened to see, walking in the distance between the fence and the mulberry trees, the white man and Uncle. The white man was taking great big steps and Uncle was literally trotting behind trying to keep up with him. He looked like a little boy running behind the headmaster heading for a good hiding. I was shocked. Here was my uncle, who had been a titan larger than life, only second in stature to God himself, was like a little bushman compared to the giant white man. This image scared me because I had never seen Uncle Ben in that light before. He had always been a giant to me, a powerful man of unshakable vision, faith and strength. But the image stuck. Needless to say, we all loved the place which was forever referred to as the plot. Uncle Ben bought the plot and we moved there from Koba in a great fanfare. And so began a new chapter in my life.